Welcome to the Tennis First webinar series. My name is Susie Riley and I'm joined by Dr. Josephine Perry, a chartered psychologist who will be presenting our first webinar on sports psychology for younger players. Just two things to mention first. Firstly, if you have any questions at all throughout the presentation, please type them into the Q&A section that's on the right of your screen, because we'll have 15 minutes at the end of the presentation and I'll be able to ask Dr. Perry some of those questions for you. And secondly, we will be running a poll throughout the presentation, so we invite you to take part in those questions. So let's begin. I'd like to welcome Dr. Josephine Perry.
Oh, thank you. Welcome, everyone. So I'm Josie. That sounds much less grown up than Josephine. I'm a sports psychologist. I've worked in 27 sports so far, but I work a lot in tennis and a lot with young tennis players who get really nervous or anxious about their performances. So we thought this would be a really good subject to start on. But we don't want to focus so much on the nerves and the anxiety that they have. That feels quite negative to some of them. We want to accept that when they're trying to perform at a high level and they really, really want to be great players, that there are going to be some nerves that come in. So what we try to do instead is focus on how they can feel braver. And from the work I've done with junior athletes, they love the feeling that they are brave, that they can handle these difficult things. So that's what we're going to cover tonight. So our goals, the biggest thing is, how do we help our child handle their nerves? And understanding that focusing on the nervous bit, that's not particularly helpful to them. What we want to do is focus on how do they notice them, accept them, and get brave enough to overcome them so they feel really proud of themselves. So we're going to go through the brave process tonight. And we'll also learn some specific techniques that you can use with your children to help them feel braver. I think we've got 8 different techniques that you can take away to be able to work with them on. So we're going to do our first poll. And that's to help me really, and maybe each other, to start to see what you notice about the worries that your child seems to have. So if you just put one in, but what seems to be the biggest worry that you notice as parents? Is it they worry they'll lose, that they'll be beaten by somebody who's ranked lower than them, that there might be some unfairness, they could get dropped from a squad or from the training that they do, that they might upset a coach by not being good enough, or they might upset you, that somebody might cheat, that they won't play well, or they'll be talked about by others. So hopefully, so I can theme what we're doing well enough, but also I think it's quite interesting to see what are those big worries that we notice. I'll give it 3, 2, 1. Okay. So we see the 2 in the lead there. They're worried they'll play badly and they're worried they'll lose. So those feel like very, very common worries that we all have as adults too. We don't want to put our heart and soul into doing something and feel like we haven't done our best. And what we'll go through tonight should hopefully cover some of that element. I'm interested to see the unfairness and the cheating bit is also coming up there. It's something we'll go into later, but it comes up so often in junior tennis because younger players often have a very, very strong sense of fairness. And when that fairness is broken, they will really struggle with it. So that's something else we'll come on to tonight. So thank you for feeding in there. We're just going to do some very basic neuroscience. I'm not going to use any of the complex elements of it, but I really like this process to think about what happens when we're playing tennis. And if we can almost think like a drone above our head of which part of our brain is working when, it helps us be better able to handle some of the emotions that we might have. So we start with thinking about our habit zone. That's just to the side of our brain, and it really focuses on repetition, on doing things, ideally without particularly consciously thinking about it. So a scientist has figured out that we have to make about 35,000 decisions every day. And if you're playing a tennis match, there's going to be a huge number of decisions you need to make within that match. And if we actively had to think about each of those decisions, we'd get very little done. And so we have habits that we work up through all of our practice. And that's one of the reasons we do so much practice in sport. Hours and hours of practice to teach our body what to do without us actively having to make decisions about it. And in a tennis match, you probably want about 90% of what you're doing to sit within the habit zone. We then have our logic zone that sits within your prefrontal cortex, right at the front of your head. That makes really good, rational, sensible decisions. And it's connected to your hippocampus, which is where all your memories and your learning sit. And when there's a decision to be made on court, that bit triggers, it goes back to the hippocampus. It looks back through the files and the knowledge of what you've done before, and it can figure out what decision to make. And it's usually a pretty good decision. So we would love, when we're playing, the other 10% of what we do to come from our logic zone. And if we just had our habit zone and our logic zone, we play tennis really well, and we would have no stress, we'd have no worries, we'd have no anxiety over it. But unfortunately, our brains aren't designed to be great tennis players. Our brains are designed for survival. They're designed to keep us alive. And that means we need a part of our brain that looks out for us, does everything it can to keep us alive. And we call that the amygdala. In here, especially when we're talking to children about it, we talk about the threat zone. And it's a part of your brain that's constantly scanning for threats. We're used to noticing it when there's a physical threat. So if you're walking home, it's late at night, somebody's walking a bit too close behind you, and you get hairs on the back of your neck stand up on end, that's your amygdala triggering. That's telling you something's not quite right and you need to get away. Most of our lives are pretty safe now, and so we don't have the amygdala triggering from physical threat very often. But what we do get is it triggering from psychological threat. And there are lots of those threats when we are playing sport at a high level, and it really, really matters to us. And when it's triggered, it's trying to do one of four things. So most of you, I'm sure, will have heard of fight or flight. So we have the fight response. I've never seen athletes getting into punch-ups before they've gone onto court, but what they do tend to do is talk a lot. And the people that are very nervous with a fight response will be quite talkative beforehand. That's how they get their nerves out. Then we have the flight response. Those are the kids that don't do matches, they don't do tournaments, they just like the training. So probably many of yours won't be within that group. They're people that don't make it as far. The one I would expect to see a lot more is a freeze response. Almost like very quiet, shutting down, don't want to be here, don't look at me, leave me alone, I want some quiet. And the final response we tend to see if somebody's had quite an abusive, shouty coach, somebody that's putting them down the whole time. And hopefully we don't have that within the system anymore. But it was something we saw in the past when they had a coach that was quite scary to them. They'd almost be treading on eggshells around them. So in order to have one of those four responses happen, our amygdala, the threat zone, circulates two chemicals, adrenaline and cortisol, and they flood your body in order to help you escape this scary thing. But obviously we can't physically escape because there's no physical thing to escape from. It's psychological. And so we end up feeling that chemical flooding our body really strongly around our body. And you may recognize some of these from when you've been doing scary things, a driving test, a job interview, having to give a speech, or playing your own sport, that we tend to have 5 key reactions when our body is flooded because we're scared in some way. Those nerves have come up. The first place we tend to see it is our tummy. So I've had athletes that will be throwing up before matches, and I've had a lot of them that go to the toilet a lot. Our body wants to be light to escape this scary thing. And so it all goes to the tummy to get rid of everything. And so a few butterflies in the tummy before a match are great. It's when it feels like there's kind of fighting going on in there. That's when it's got a bit too much. The next place it tends to go is our heart rate. Our heart rate will rise. And obviously, actually, we want to feel fairly calm at the start of a match. A little bit heightened, but not too much. Big one is that our breathing rate increases. And that's really tricky because we're going to be getting out of breath while we're playing. So actually, we want to keep it as low as possible until we start playing. And the really big problem with your breathing rate and your heart rate going up is that your brain, your amygdala, is looking out for threats. And when your heart rate, your breathing rate go up, that's a threat, suggesting something's wrong, sends around more cortisol and adrenaline around your body, and you get into this horrible cycle. Then the really big one for tennis players, you get tight muscles, and it particularly shows up in your back and shoulder muscles. And this is the one you can see so clearly when you're watching matches. You can almost see someone's amygdala has popped out. Something has happened to them. They've started to lose, or they've even started to think, I might win. And that feels quite threatening because they could lose from that. And they get very tight shoulder muscles and back muscles. And it's like their serve falls apart. They're really unable to perform in the same way they could. And the fifth thing we tend to see is a loss of peripheral vision and some of your senses. Tennis, that's not so bad. You know where to focus. In some other sports, say like rugby, if you're going to have a great big person coming in from the side that you can't spot because you're so focused and narrowed your focus, you're going to get injured. So different elements of that impact different athletes through a personal impact, but also through the sport that they're doing. But I think the one we really look out for in tennis is that tight muscles around the shoulders and back, because however many times you've, say, practiced to serve, when you're practicing, you're quite calm, you're relaxed, you put the right amount of effort into it. When you're super tight and tense, the same amount of effort will have a very different impact. So it's really helpful to chat to your kids and ask about how do they feel if they get nervous, and not just what's going around in their minds, but how does their body feel? Because if they can start to spot the feelings in their body earlier, they can start to do some of the things that mitigate it earlier. It can become a really good early warning system. So the more you can talk to them about how do they physically feel when they get nervous, the better you can learn them and they can learn themselves. So a quick trick, this is my favorite trick with kids. If they get anxious before a match or even during a match, it's quite quick, so you can do this in a short break, is if they've got anxious and nerves coming up, their breathing rate will go from about 12 breaths a minute, which is normal for each of us, up to about 20, 22. When they do that, they're not getting in good quality oxygen. It's going very high in their lungs. They might end up getting sweaty palms or tingly fingers, and they feel very almost hyperventilating, ramped up. We use something called colourful breathing to try and break the cycle. I've used purple and pink because they're my favourite colours. But your kids, it's really nice to ask them which colours they would like to use for it. Gives them a bit of autonomy, and really helpful to help them think through how to calm everything down. This takes our breathing rate, if we're anxious, from 20, 22 down to about 5 or 6 breaths a minute. So it's a massive change. It then stops telling our brain something is wrong. And we purposely breathe in colourful air that we're imagining because it stops us ruminating all the things we're worried about in our match. And we slow down the breathing so that our body gets the break. So this might feel very odd on a webinar, but if you don't mind rolling with it, if you could close your eyes, I'm going to try a couple of rounds and see if it makes you feel nice and calm now. So I would like to breathe in purple air through your nose for 4, 3, 2, 1. And breathe out pink air through your mouth for 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Purple air in through your nose for 4, 3, 2, 1. and pink air out through your mouth for 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and open your eyes. So that's a really nice one to do with your children if they get anxious before a match or before anything else in life. It is also a really cool trick if they're struggling to sleep at night, or you're struggling to sleep at night. I do it with my 6-year-old. She's never done more than 5 of these and not fallen asleep. So it's a really, really nice way to almost trick your brain into thinking it's falling asleep. But it's lovely if they have a panic attack or they have like high anxiety before a match. This is the go-to technique to try. The things that tend to trigger our threat zone. It's really helpful to help your child know theirs, but also for you to know what scenarios put them most likely into their threat zone. Many of my adult pros tell me that having to play someone they train with a lot in a match, in a tournament, is one of their big threat zones. It really gets them in a way that others don't. But some of the more generic, general elements, if somebody violates a value that's important to you, it really triggers us. So you think about it, if you have a value, say, of respect, and someone rocks up late, having got a coffee on the way to meet you, that value is going to be really triggered and you'll be much more annoyed than if that's not a key value to you. And I really mention these because one of the biggest things I see in junior tennis is fairness as a value, and the amygdala is being triggered all over the places in matches when there are dodgy line calls. And you can see as soon as someone has got angry that they think somebody else has been cheated, they will lose it on court and they will find it very, very hard to continue to play well. They'll get those tight shoulders. They won't be able to serve properly. So helping them deal with that fairness element, I think, is really important to kind of chat about what they might do, what they'd rather do. The other ones, as we saw from that poll, fear of failure is huge. Fear of judgment, fear of people talking about them or writing about them can be a really difficult one. One of the toughest ones to crack is perfectionism. If you've got a little voice in your head that says, I should be perfect, it means anytime you do anything, your amygdala is going to be triggered because you can't be perfect. It doesn't exist. And so the more we as parents can talk to our children about not aiming for perfection, aiming for being brilliant, or aiming for achieving the goal we set, or aiming to learn from whatever mistake we make on the court, the more we can change the narrative around perfectionism, the better. Because that's the one I see. I still see adults in their 50s and their 60s that are held back by that perfectionism. So the more we can work with it on our juniors, the better. Expectations are big threat zone triggers. I have never worked with a parent who didn't genuinely want the best for their child and didn't care if they never played tennis again, if their child would be happy about it. But yeah, I often work with junior athletes who feel that they need to do well in their tennis to make their parents happy, and that they know their parents have invested so much time and money into their sport and driven them all over the country to matches and taken them to all their training, that they really want to almost be able to pay back that investment you've made in them. And so even though I know that is no parent's intention, sometimes that's how they translate it. So the more that can be made clear that there is no expectations in that point, the expectations are around them being happy, not them having to win, the more helpful it can be to them, and it triggers their threat zone less. And then the poor communication tends to come more from coaching, where they don't understand sometimes why they are doing certain things or why they've been put into certain tournaments or not. And maybe have been judged by the coach not to need to understand that. And I often find some of the tennis players are so intelligent and they really want to understand why they're doing things, that more of that communication can help them. So those are the common threat zone triggers I tend to see, but there might well be specific ones that you notice with your child. And if you can look out for those, almost see them as a lesson to learn from these, so that you can practice different scenarios with them, or you can protect them a bit more when you know you're going to be in one of those situations with them. That is an incredibly helpful role that you can play as a parent. So I'm going to take you on to the BRAVE process. This is based on the psychological approach I work with all my athletes. And it's an approach called ACT. So it stands for Acceptance and Commitment Therapy. It's used a huge amount in sports psychology now, but it's also used for trauma, for depression, for anxiety, for pain management. But my version of it is designed for high performers, particularly almost every athlete I see with performance anxiety. I call my VIPs. They're very intelligent perfectionists. And so it's designed with very intelligent perfectionists in mind. And it neatly, don't know how this happened, it spells out BRAVE. So we've got the first stage is being aware of your thoughts, because it's really easy to want to ignore them, but this is really important we're aware of them. Reassigning them to a character, which sounds a bit crazy, but we'll go into and explain why. Advocating for yourself, or helping your child advocate for themselves. Value activation. And that's tricky as a younger person, but we'll expand on that. And then engaging in a plan. So if we go through each stage, I've incorporated some different techniques you can use, but really helping them think through each stage. And you getting to know how to do this means you can step in at the right points and help direct them. So the first section, being aware. It feels, and all the advice we get given so much when we're worried about something, don't worry about it. It'll be fine. You always do really well. It's okay. Forget about it. And yet, if I was to say to you all, do not think about purple elephants. I imagine almost all of you will now have a troop of purple elephants walking across your brain. The more we try and forget about something and not think about something, the more it taps on the edge of our head being there. So this approach is all about accepting that we're going to have some unhelpful, unpleasant thoughts and not trying to block them out, but notice they're there and start to remove some of the worry about having those unhelpful thoughts. So if you can have that conversation with them about the amygdala, there's these 3 bits of your brain. There's a habit zone, which is why you do all the practice to put as much stuff in your habit zone as possible. There's a logic zone, which is when you use the really helpful bit of your brain to make great decisions. That's what me and your coaches are helping you think about. But there's also this threat zone. And there are some things that will trigger that threat zone, and they'll change the way your body feels, and they'll stop you being able to play tennis as well as you would like. So just in those simple terms, but really being able to help them go, so that's the annoying part of my brain. And the important element to remind them of is that your amygdala, your threat zone, doesn't hate you. It's not out to get you in any way, but its job is to keep you safe. And if you want to be a great tennis player, you can't be safe. You have to stretch yourself. You have to leave your comfort zone. You have to do things that feel really difficult. You have to put yourself out there on a court, facing your opponent with people watching you. For your amygdala, that feels really scary. And your amygdala will do as much as it possibly can to try to talk you out of it. It will give you those messages. I'm rubbish. I can't do this. I'm going to be laughed at. I'm going to embarrass myself. I'm going to fail. All of those messages that many of us have in our heads, but we try not to listen to. In this process, we're actively asking ourselves what they are. And the more you can chat through with them that, the more they can start to work on them and think about them. So it feels uncomfortable, but it becomes a much more natural conversation the more you do it. So there's our first one, being aware of the messages. And one of the things I find perfectionists really struggle with is their emotional literacy. We end up, scientists found out that we use about 6 or 7 emotions all the time when we talk. So I call them the lazy emotions. And they're the ones in the middle. So if you're like, how are you doing? Apart from the I'm fine, we get the I'm tired, I'm nervous, I'm excited, happy, powerless, accepted, frustrated, disgusted, angry, or low. They tend to be the most common emotions. When we only have one emotion like that, so if I say I'm angry, we tend to only have one coping mechanism for it. So I'm a runner. If I'm angry, my coping mechanism is to go for a run. But if I'm having a really bad day and 4 people have annoyed me, I cannot go for 4 runs. I will have no energy and I'll get a stress fracture. So much better is to be able to look around the edge of the hexagon here and go, how am I actually feeling? And it's one of the questions I ask every client that walks into my clinic when I'm like, how are you doing? They're like, I'm fine. I'm like, how are you really? And then they tell you what's actually going on. And if we can do with this, our children, our version of this at home is stuck on the fridge. And I'm a really annoying mum. And as my daughter walks in, I'll be like, how are you really feeling? But it means she gets to learn some of the outside words. And it means we can have much more specific coping mechanisms. So if I'm actually not angry, I'm feeling envious. I've seen that another sports psychologist has got a really cool contract that I'd have loved. Going for a run is not going to help that. But actually assessing, well, what element is it that I'm envious of? Is it that I want to work in that sport? Or is it that I want the money she's going to make for it? I want the reputation. You can then take it away and go and work on a plan for it. If your child comes in and says, oh, I'm tired. It's like, well, how tired? And they're like, actually, I'm probably a bit overwhelmed. I've got too much homework to do. And I feel like I'm rushed at tennis. And I haven't actually just caught up with my friends in ages. That could be okay, shall we organise a play date? So you can be much more specific if you use something like this. And it really helps them identify emotions so that they can become much more aware of them and you can have much better conversations. So a sheet like this is really helpful for having those conversations. Stage 2, reassigning your amygdala to being a character. 1, because it's really hard to say and spell amygdala, and it's a very sciencey word. But if we can create a character for our child with them, that they can then kind of talk about almost as a shortcut to I'm feeling nervous, I'm feeling anxious, it becomes a much easier way to have that conversation. So my daughter has a lion. Hers is just called Lion. And when we have to do something scary, like have an injection, we talk about how Lion is feeling and what Lion is saying to her. And it's a really nice way of distancing the thoughts that come from our amygdala from the facts that are true. Because when it feels like it's all inside our brain, it feels like the things the amygdala says, I am rubbish, I can't play tennis, I'm going to lose. They feel factual and true. And they're not. They're just thoughts. Thoughts are fleeting, thoughts come and go, thoughts change. And by giving them to a character, we get to think of them a bit separately. We're distancing ourselves. So it's not, I am rubbish at tennis. It's, Lion is telling me I'm not very good at tennis. Okay, let's go and show Lion what we can do. So you get that distance and you get to have a little bit of break from feeling like you're beating yourself up. So this is a really nice one to actually do with your children, to talk about your amygdala and what yours says to you. If you can have that conversation, it really helps with their emotional literacy. But it also just becomes such a good shortcut to having much better conversations about those nerves and where the nerves are coming from and the things that they're worried about. So some people like to have an animal. Some people just like a name. Some people have things. I've had people call it, it looked like a fire alarm before. It's like, oh, my fire alarm's going off. What's your fire alarm saying to you? But it just gives you that separation, that it's not a fact. You're not rubbish at tennis. You're not going to lose. You're not going to be laughed at. It's a thought that you're worried about. So it's a really nice kind of distancing process. And then we get to the advocating for themselves. This one's tricky as a parent because we can see how good they are at things and we want to really big them up, but they need to do it for themselves. When it's somebody else telling us, we don't always believe it. Or often the juniors will say to me, my mum says I'm brilliant, but she has to say that because she loves me, which is lovely. They know how much you guys adore them, but they kind of need to be able to recognize it for themselves. So the more when you're talking to them, you can not give them the answers, but ask them the questions. What did you do really well today in tennis? What did your coach say you're doing well on? What do you see as your big strength? What have you improved on lately? What have you been working hard on that you're now better at? Those were really helpful. What we tend to find a lot is comparisons. So-and-so's better than me. So-and-so can serve faster than me. And my really cheesy line for that one, if you compare, you despair. Because it only brings us misery. If we're comparing with anyone, we're comparing with ourselves and where we used to be and where we've got to and where we want to go, but not with other people. So if they start doing that one, bring it back to, yeah, but what have you been doing? You can only control your own tennis. What have you been focusing on? The other one to think about really is if you are a perfectionist, mistakes feel so threatening, it is easier not to try. And so you won't try. And that's one of the reasons often juniors won't play certain tournaments or won't put themselves up for selection for things because they're almost frozen by the fear of making a mistake. So the more we as parents can celebrate mistakes, talk about how helpful they are to help us learn, talk about our own times we've made mistakes and kind of almost have a bit of vulnerability with them of, oh, I messed that up. I learned so much from it. That is a really strong message to kind of be feeding into their lives. And the younger you can do that, the better. The more you can reward the attitude or the effort they had and the less about winning. The problem with focusing on winning is the opposite of winning is losing. And we're terrified of losing. And so it becomes very threatening. But if we're really focusing on attitude or effort, they can always focus on that. And we know when they put in more effort and they have a great attitude, they do tend to win more. As a psychologist who works with athletes going off to tournaments all the time, I have to try so hard. Hopefully I manage it most of the time, but I never ask the result. Often they tell me, but I will never ask an athlete what their result was because I want them to know that's not the important bit. The important bit was the skills they used, the effort they put in, the bravery they showed at doing different types of skills than they've used before. And the more we can all do that, the more we take it away from winning and instead about being brilliant. And help your kids collect facts and figures. A really helpful fact to remember, because our brains are designed for survival, they remember negatives much more strongly than positives, about 5 times the strength. So if you've messed something up once, you really, really remember that much more than all the times you've done it really, really well. And so if you can help your children collect facts and figures of how well they've done something or any of their tennis facts that they can have on a sheet of paper that they can look through, that's really, really helpful. It helps kind of advocate for themselves back to whatever they've called their amygdala. And then into this, it helps if you can help them see the long-term effect. So often tennis players will be like, I tried working really hard on my skills. I did everything well. I still lost. It's like, yeah, sometimes you will, but it's not about an individual match. It's about focusing over, say, a year. And the more you focus on your skills and you're being brilliant and setting individual goals of abilities you're going to use or focus in matches, over a year, that will absolutely come together. But there will be some losses in there because you can't win every match. So helping them to see that development takes time and it's spiky. You're going to have runs where it's amazing and you're going to have runs where it's awful. And they're all going through puberty and when they get into puberty, that changes lots of things. Their body starts doing things they're not used to it doing. They have growth spurts, so they're not used to moving in the same way. It will mean they'll have difficult times. And the fact I love giving to the young ones is that when they do research on multi-medal winners in sports, they find the best athletes do not specialize fully until they're 14. So one of the things I loved after Emma Raducanu did really well last year was talking about all the different sports she did. And actually you can learn loads from different sports. So we don't want someone purely focused on tennis. We want them learning from other things, and they tend to do better long term with that. Then we get to values. So as adults, knowing our values is super important, because it means we can always make decisions based in line with our values. It's much harder as children. They don't understand half the words we would use as values. But if we can help them know why they play tennis, why it matters to them, we can help them focus when they're answering back their amygdala. They give it some facts and figures, but they also give it the reason, and I'm going to play anyway because. So when they do research on why children play sport, the top 5 reasons: to have fun, do something I'm good at, improve my skills, stay healthy, exercise, and the other one that comes up a huge amount, to see my friends. Winning is never in there. And yet when they start getting into some kind of certain levels of tournaments, that winning element starts to get pushed upon them, and it becomes talked about much more. The longer we can keep it about fun and learning new skills and being with our friends, the better they will play, and the more they'll enjoy it, and the more likely they are to stay. It used to be thought about 13 was particularly when girls would start dropping out of sport. And the research is showing it's actually starting to be at about 8 or 9 now. So we want to keep them having the fun side of it for as long as possible. And the more you can help them understand why they play, the more they can repeat that back to their amygdala, whatever they've called it, when it starts being annoying towards them. So that's a really nice conversation to have with them too. And then one of my favourite sessions to do with juniors, particularly because I learn what all the cool music is now I feel far too grown up and old, is creating a playlist. And this is what you're going to listen to in the car on the way to matches. And if you can design it so it helps them remember why they play, it's really powerful. So you probably want about 8 to 10 tracks. You want to listen to it on shuffle, because one of the best things about music is that it triggers certain chemicals in our brain. One of them is dopamine. It's our reward chemical. And it triggers it particularly well if we don't know what's coming next. So if you listen to something all the time and you're like, oh yeah, here comes this, lovely. But if you're in the car and then suddenly the first few bars of track you both love come on, and you're both like, oh, I love this track, gives you that real boost, that real oomph. So you want stuff on there, gets them fired up, that they know well. It's got meaning. So certainly if there's tracks that come from TV shows or movies that they love, those are really powerful for them. Or anything that's got really positive memories associated with it. If you can put that onto a playlist that they can put in, especially if they're a freeze kind of athlete and they shut down a bit beforehand, they go quiet. If they can plug that in before they have to go on, it's a really nice way to get them into the right level of activation before they have to go and perform. And it's a really fun thing to do with them too. You get to sit there and make loads of cool music together, and it feels like you're officially training. And then the E, engaging their plan. So this is a lovely technique to do together. We try to break down, we call it a what if plan. In one list down this worry side, all of their worries about tournaments that they're going into, training that they're doing, and get them in a big long list. They will say at some point, oh, this one sounds really silly, but those are definitely the ones to be on there. They're the most important ones on there, because they're the ones that are at the bottom of our tummy that we daren't really say, but we are worried about them. There's some lovely research on this from the University of Chicago, where they got a big bunch of students, got them to take a maths exam, and then they said to them, you're going to take the exam again in half an hour. If you do worse, you have to give us money. If you do better, we'll give you money. So throwing in that anxiety, because students do not want to give away money. And they separated the group into two, and half the group got to sit and chat to their friends, and the other half of the group got to write down their worries about taking this exam. The group that got to just sit and chat to friends did 5% better. The group that wrote down their worries did 12% better. And they didn't do anything with their worries. They literally wrote them down. So having this process of writing down your worries, helpful anyway, brilliant for helping them think about what might trigger their amygdala. But you've also got a long list of things you could actually do something about. So then you go on to the prevention. How do we prevent this happening? I'm worried I will lose. Well, how do we get you really up to speed on the skills that you need so you feel more confident? I'm worried my shoelaces will come undone and I'll trip over. Okay, well, let's make sure we've double laced them or you've got elastic laces in them. So you can do some really practical things that make them feel a bit more confident. And then the really important one, if then. That's that if this still happens, what will you do? Because in the moment, if something goes wrong, our amygdala kicks in and we don't have a great response to it. We throw our tennis racket, we shout at somebody, we storm off, we sulk. If we have pre-prepared what we will do in that moment, we have a plan to follow. We just follow the plan. The prefrontal cortex, the logic zone, stays in charge. So we want to have pre-planned for loads of those issues, and it means they won't come up. So again, that's another really nice technique that you can sit down and do with your child. And then the more you can celebrate process and progress and not winning and outcomes and scores and rankings, the better. And I know it is really, really hard. And it's our entire culture as a society is to focus on scores and win and loss. But the more they feel like they're developing competency and they're becoming masterful at their skills and they're developing and they're progressing, the better they tend to do overall. So the irony is they're much more likely to win if they stop trying to win. And the more we can kind of change our language around that, the better. And the final technique I will give you kind of pulls quite a lot of this together. So it is something I have stashes of these cards that I give to all my athletes, and they have to complete one before every match. So they put the event up, they write their goal down, and as you'll imagine, after everything I've lectured on, they are not allowed to write that their goal is to win. It has to be something they can control. So that could be a really strong focus on their serve, or about taking brave moves, or fast feet on court, or using their powerful backhand. But it's a goal that they can control and they can work on throughout the match. Coach on a shoulder is taken from the idea of Alice in Wonderland, where she drinks that mixture in a tiny little vial that says drink me, and she becomes tiny. So it's if their coach was sitting on their shoulder, what would their coach say in their ear? And almost every athlete I have can tell me in seconds what's the one thing that they're always being yelled at to do. For me as a runner, my coach would be like, head up, because my head goes up, my shoulders go back, chest goes forward, I can lift my legs up, I run faster without even trying. And so almost all of our athletes will know what that is. Then we ask them to think about 3 strengths that they're bringing to this specific match. So it really helps them focus on the good stuff they've done. 3 sessions they've done in the build-up. And that's where, when you've been keeping track of things, can be really helpful. So it's like, what did you do on Tuesday at training that was really good? So they've got front of mind the stuff they're great at. Their motivational mantra. This one's tricky when you're young. Most of us as adults, it's often for other people or it's for our family that gives us that motivation to go out and do a great job. But if you've worked with them on their why, on the things that are important to them, that can often come into it. So it's a short, sweet, sharp little saying that they can have to themselves. Sometimes they might write it on their hand, but something to think about. Why am I doing this? Goes in that box. And then an interesting conversation to have with them. I perform at my best when, because it makes them think about what kind of conditions help them perform well. Often it's when my mum or dad are watching, though I have to say I've sometimes had when my mum and dad aren't watching, because I get much more nervous when they're there and I'd rather they were in the cafe and I'll just see them afterwards. But it could be when I'm feeling loud and bouncy, when I've listened to great music, when I've eaten a Mars bar. They'll often come up with their things, but it's the stuff, like the routine beforehand, that makes them feel good. So that's the final box. And I tend to do it 3 or 4 days before their match, so that anytime they get nervous in the build-up, they've got this to read through and they can kind of feel a bit more reassured. So if I can work the poll. No. How do I get the next poll? Oh, here we go. Thank you. So I'd love to see if you could feed in one of those techniques, I think we've gone through 8, that you might like to try with your children. Don't expect anyone to go and do all 8. But maybe 1 or 2 that you feel might work for you. We've got colourful breathing, identifying the emotions, naming the amygdala, building up evidence to advocate for yourself, finding their why, creating a performance playlist, the what if plan, or celebrating effort and skills. Cool. I will end the poll in 3, 2, 1. So hopefully you can all see that come out top. Creating a performance playlist, which is super fun to do, and what if planning. It's a really nice way to help them feel like they're much more in control of the things that are going to happen. And also high up there, naming the amygdala. That's a nice fun one to do. And it's just a really nice shortcut. They don't want to have to say to you, I'm feeling really nervous. But if they can say, Lion is out, or Bob's come to visit, or whatever they've named it, it just gives you that really nice shortcut to have some nice conversations with them. So hopefully you found something there that feels helpful. And I'm open to any questions.
Okay, well, thank you so much. That's was fascinating. I have to say, I do love the naming it the lion, or giving it that special name, and then separating it from yourself. I see that's quite high on the poll, but that was something I think will stand out for a lot of parents and players. If any parents on the call would like to put any questions in with the chat function here, you'll see on the right there's a Q&A. It can come through as admin only, straight to me, or put it on as the group. If you'd like to put a question in, I have had one come in, so we can start with this one. What if a child is nervous for quite a few hours before a match? So do you keep repeating, or so if it's just this long period of time that they're feeling really nervous or anxious, what should we do then?
A few hours before a match is probably pretty good. I have to say, I've seen athletes for a week before a match. So if you've got one that's a few hours, that's actually pretty okay. I wouldn't worry too much. Remind them that it's good. It shows they care about what they're doing and they're in a sport that matters to them. Definitely use the colourful breathing anytime they start to get it, and get them to complete something like the confidence booster, so that they're actually having that conversation with their amygdala themselves, really. So you can go through that kind of, what strengths have you noticed you've been working on? Something that comes up a lot is that they don't want to be told what to do and reminded lots about the match and how to do it. So one of the best questions that a parent can ask beforehand is like, what's your coach asked you to focus on? Or what do you want to focus on? and then go, okay, well, you can only do that in the match. So listening to performance playlist is great because it takes your mind off it. Distraction can be pretty good. But not trying to say, almost one of the worst things you can say is, I know you're going to do well. And we absolutely want to say that. We want to reassure them. But that actually just adds on extra expectation and pressure. So it's much more about, well, what can you do to control how you're going to play? I could do this and this. Brilliant. Go do that. But even from a really young age, the more autonomy you give them, the better they feel about things, the more they feel they're in charge and in control. And one of the scariest things about a match is you're not in control, because somebody else might be really, really good. And it doesn't matter what you do. They might beat you and you're not in control. So if as parents, we can give them some control, that helps them feel better.
Great. And we've got another one that's come in. Should we tell the coaches to also ask about the lion so it becomes more comfortable and normal to talk about, so that more people who talk about the same language, the better?
Yes, I love that. So if I do a group talk with juniors, we'll literally have them all in the room. They'll give a name and they create an animal or a character. And it becomes such a good conversation piece. There's a version of this that many of parents, I'm sure, will have read the book, called The Chimp Paradox by Professor Steve Peters. And he worked at Team Sky with the GB cycling guys. And in all the teams that those cycling guys have gone into, all the pro cycling teams, I met and was chatting to the director sportif of Team Ineos Grenadiers the other day. And he said he uses chimp as shortcut all the time. So they might be out in a race and somebody he can see, he's northern, he was talking about, they've got their cob on. It's like they're really sulking. You can see they're getting really angry or anxious about things. And he's like, they just use it as a shortcut of like, hey mate, your chimp's out, bring it back in. And it's such a nice short way of not saying to somebody something horrible, but like, oh, you're not in a good place, are you? Can we do something? Or in cycling terms, they're probably not quite so polite, but it gives a really nice shortcut. So absolutely, if you can get lots of people talking about it and just make it much more normal to talk about your nerves. Some of the worry comes from the fact that you shouldn't be worried. And if we kind of get a bit more accepting of the fact, this matters to you.
Yes.
And we're going to be worried, that's okay. And so many more people are worried than they will ever realise. That I'm biased, that's all I see is people who are worried about it. But there are an awful lot of people who have those fears. And the more we talk about it and just normalise that if you're trying to be really good at something, it's risky, it's threatening to your sense of who you are. And particularly if tennis is your main sport, if you were to go to, I know, a camp at half term coming up and someone says, oh, what do you do? And their first thing is like, I play tennis. That means every tennis tournament's going to feel quite threatening. So yeah, the more we can talk about lion or whatever they call it, the better.
Brilliant. And we have another question. Any dangers of changing the language from nervous to excited?
Oh, I love that question. Thank you, Andrew. It's a fascinating one. The feelings in our body are exactly the same if we are nervous or excited. It's just our brain translating them. However, sometimes it feels a bit inauthentic when we know we're really, really nervous to try and claim that it's excitement. It kind of feels like a bit of that toxic positivity. It's like we're trying to trick ourselves. But one of my favourite quotes of all time comes from Chris Hoy, the cyclist. And he went through severe anxiety when he used to cycle. He used to have 2 people put him on the bike before he could go and race at like a world championships. He was so nervous. And he worked with Steve Peters on this. And so his quote is, I am not anxious, I am adrenalized. And I like that as a midpoint, because you're not trying to be toxically positive of like, yeah, I'm really up for this. Because no, you are nervous. But if you start to feel it as like, what I'm feeling is adrenaline, preparing my body to go and do something special, then it feels like a really nice compromise. So if we can teach our children about adrenaline, and that's a good thing, it means we're getting ready for something, then we get a nice midpoint.